Research shows that categorizing someone as black can affect medical care. For instance, doctors might miss cystic fibrosis in black patients because it is considered a white disease. Similarly, because blood disorders called thalassemias are considered a white disease and sickle cell anemia a black disease, they are sometimes misdiagnosed when they strike the wrong racial group. This lecture looks briefly at some problematic uses of the concept of race in medicine and discusses one proposed path from race-based medicine to race-conscious medicine. Using race as a biological category in medical research and clinical practice has harmful consequences. The higher rates of hypertension and breast cancer deaths among African Americans, for instance, likely reflect socioeconomic, environmental, and other non-genetic factors. Many health disparities are not about race, but about social conditions, such as education and access to healthcare. So, analyzing health data through a racial perspective can blind scientists to factors that contribute more to those disparities. But despite leading geneticists arguing that race is not a true biological category, many scientists and medical practitioners still use race as a way to group people, asking, for instance, which genetic variants are more common in this or that race. One reason for this continued practice is that many still consider the concept useful, if imperfect. Race typically means white, Caucasian, black, African, or Asian. That trio is based on easily visible traits, such as skin color and facial features, that biologists once assumed reflected ancestry and therefore shared genes. But these broad categories are both poorly defined and flawed surrogates. In this context, surrogate means that black, for instance, is used to stand for having ancestral roots in Africa. But the genomes of African Americans are, on average, 24% European. That is, 1/4 of their genetic variants originated in populations in Europe. The average European American genome is 4% African. So, while race provides a clue to ancestral origins and therefore genetic inheritance, it is an imprecise clue because many people have ancestors from many regions of the world. A black American often has important white gene variants, including ones linked to disease. One suggestion made in response to this issue is to move away from the big three racial categories and substitute something more accurate. For instance, it has been proposed that research journals should discourage use of racial categories in studies that analyze genetic or other biological or medical data, substituting more precise groupings such as ancestry or population, Kurdish or Basque, for example, or Filipino, Japanese, or Ito. A fair-sized contingent of biologists disagree. They agree that race is an imperfect concept, but say it is a useful way to group people. Focusing on how race traces genetic ancestry, some biologists have proposed using 7 instead of 3 racial categories. The extra 4 groupings came from breaking Asians and Caucasians into finer classifications such as East Asian and Pacific Islander. Although 7 is definitely bigger than 3, the more important question is whether this shift in numbers suffices to mitigate the more systematic biases observed against certain groups of people in medical care. In response, some theorists have pointed out that the problem is more general, and it has to do with the fact that in biomedical literature, race is often operationalized as a risk factor, a biological predisposition that drives different outcomes. But focusing on race as a risk factor that predicts disease or disability because of genetic susceptibility has made most scientists ignore how the external visibility or social components of race have generated systematic harm against certain populations both historically and at an institutional level. In In other words, scientists have ignored how certain social mechanisms contribute to racial disparities in health. Health disparities, just like disparities in education, employment, and incarceration, result from a great number of social inequalities that disproportionately impact certain groups. For instance, while African American women still face high rates of maternal mortality, white men are most likely to die from opioid overdose. Neither of these are biological predispositions. So, the emerging proposal is to conceptualize race not as a risk factor, but as a risk marker of vulnerability, bias, and systematic prejudice and harm. Summing up, the causes of racial disparities in health and across societies are numerous and non-discrete. So the question to begin with, do we or don't we use race in medicine, seems to be flawed. Instead, we should be asking, how do we use race well? Keeping race as a black box concept, while at the same time using it as a proxy for genetics, ancestry, behavior, or culture, will contribute to maintaining and deepening racial health inequities. How? In epidemiological and clinical research, disease will continue to be linked to race. This vague connection will be propagated to medical education, where racial groups will be understood and approached as being inherently diseased. The effects of medical education will then translate in clinical practice into healthcare bias and stereotyping. Even basic research contributes to maintaining these health inequities by reinforcing a tenuous link between the vague concepts of race and biology. This will translate into reinforcing, through medical education, biological notions of race, which will then lead to racially tailored clinical practices with all the associated inequalities. As an alternative, it has been proposed that one should emphasize, both in medical research and clinical practice, that race is a socially constructed, aka power concept. This perspective should push for an analysis of the sources and effects of structural racism, which in turn should inform the curricula of medical studies by teaching the effects of racism on health and health policies. In the clinical practice setup, this shift should translate into offering more support to both patients and physicians to overcome the structural barriers to health inequities. This staged process of change from race-based medicine to race-conscious medicine should benefit the wider population by reducing existing health inequities. But since healthcare is only one institution affected by structural racism, a more effective process of repairing racial health disparities will require collaboration across sectors of housing, education, transportation, criminal justice, and environmental justice. Healthcare practitioners can use their cultural capital to advocate for anti-racist policies. Through conscious effort and collaboration, healthcare providers can work towards racial equity within and beyond the walls of examination rooms. So, race, like other important topics in medicine, including gender, sex, sexuality, and disability, requires a level of analysis, training, and comprehension that is much more nuanced than a simple direction, do I talk about it or don't I? Medical practitioners, bioethicists, and philosophers seem to agree that moving away from the health disparities created by current uses of the concept of race in medicine requires an open discussion about racism in both scientific practice and medical care. So, what are the general lessons about the concept of race itself that one can extract from these debates? First lesson is that instead of framing the option as being one between keeping the current reductive or black box notion of race in medical studies and practice versus giving it all together, one should emphasize the social context of the category of race and its uses through careful analysis of its history, political economy, and geography. One should also try to move away from a conceptualization of race as a risk factor to one which characterizes it as a risk marker, thus signaling a host of other factors responsible for observed health disparities. It should be acknowledged that adopting a social constructivist perspective on the concept of race does not rule out the possibility of there being interesting biological facts to be discovered about it. However, it does imply a straightforward rejection of any simplistic biological, genetic essentialism concerning the category of race. The shift from a race-based to a race-conscious medicine marks the recognition of the fact that we have a responsibility to diversify our institutions and scholarly perspectives on the way towards better clinical practice.